Imagine this. You have no phone in your hands. There is nothing to scroll through on a screen. No notification sounds, no messages, no likes. Just you, your family, and a vast Sunday afternoon stretching out before you. Once upon a time, Sundays in America were exactly like this. Silence was not an absence. It was a gift. Returning from church services at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, families would take off their jackets, leave their shoes aside, and breathe in the smell of roasted meat filling the house. From that moment until evening, time seemed to flow at an entirely different pace. Today, those hours have vanished. But why? And what were those Sunday afternoons really like? In this video, we will journey back to the quietest hours of an America without phones, computers, or the internet, guided by real historical records and personal testimonies. In the middle of the 20th century, Sunday in America had an entirely different rhythm from the other 6 days. This was not just a day of rest. It was a shared moment where almost the entire society stopped and took a breath, all at the same time. Researchers note that the period from the mid-1950s to the early 1960s was one of the times with the highest church attendance in American history. According to some measurements, nearly half of all adults reported attending a religious service within the past week. This was not just a religious habit, it was also the starting point of a weekly rhythm. During that time, regulations still in effect in many states, known as blue laws, restricted commercial activities on Sundays. These laws were the continuation of a tradition dating back to the colonial era, and their purpose was to provide people with a shared day of rest. Department stores would be closed. In some states, selling cars was prohibited, and in some places, only goods considered essential, like bread, milk, newspapers, and medicine, could be sold. And so, on Sundays, the town's main street would grow quiet. Storefronts would shut down, and people would turn not to shops, but to each other. The story we will tell in this video is exactly the story of the warmth experienced within this very silence. Sunday mornings began early. Families would put on their best clothes, children would have their hair combed, and fathers would straighten their ties. Going to church was not merely a religious service, but also a way to reconnect with neighbors, relatives, and the community. After the service, people would linger on the church steps, sharing the week's news with one another and talking about how their children were growing. Returning home would mark the beginning of perhaps the most beloved moment of the day, the Sunday dinner. In many homes, this meal was the most carefully prepared feast of the week. Fried chicken or roast beef, mashed potatoes, freshly baked bread. Grandmothers were usually in the kitchen from the early hours of the morning. In some families, this meal consisted of more than just the mother, father, and children. Aunts, uncles, and cousins would join the table, filling the house with a crowded, yet peaceful hum. There were no phones at the table, of course, but more importantly, in those days, there were no devices at all to distract you. Conversations flowed, uninterrupted. Children learned table manners here, while adults shared the exhaustion of the week. Looking at the center of town after lunch, you would be met with a strange silence. The shops were closed. Tailors, shoemakers, most grocery stores, all had pulled down their shutters. In some states, even barbers were forbidden to work on Sundays, a restriction that the courts had upheld time and time again. Over the years, this also sparked debates. Jewish merchants, in particular, whose own religious day of rest was Saturday, took their objections to court, arguing they were forced to remain closed for 2 consecutive days. However, these debates primarily intensified from the 1960s onward. In the era we are describing for these afternoons, closed shutters were still a natural part of the day. But as the town's main street grew quiet, the doors of the homes became ever more open. Neighbors would drop by each other's porches, children would run freely in the streets,
and no one would look at their watch and worry, are they in danger? According to one study, the neighborhood back then had a structure where everyone knew one another, and children were looked after collectively. If a child misbehaved, the news would reach their mother before they even arrived home. Once the table was cleared and the dishes were washed, the house would generally settle into a deep calm. In many families, this was almost an unwritten rule. On Sunday afternoons, even the most mischievous children were encouraged to quiet down. Fathers would stretch out in their armchairs, usually reading the Sunday edition of the newspaper. Those thick, illustrated supplements, filled with puzzles, were among the most anticipated readings of the week. Mothers would sometimes take a short nap, or sometimes continue with unfinished sewing. For children, these hours carried a different meaning. Some would bury themselves in a book. Others would lie on the rug and stare at the ceiling. These moments of boredom might seem strange by today's standards, but for the children of that era, being bored was not a problem. It was a natural part of dreaming and inventing games.
Family members would gather in the living room, sitting around a single radio set, listening together to broadcasts ranging from dramas to comedy shows. This was vastly different from today's experience, where everyone looks at their own screen. It was a truly shared experience. However, as the 1950s progressed, the television began to settle into the center of American homes. According to the archives of the Library of Congress, while television was present in roughly 1 million American households in 1949, 10 years later, that number had reached 50 million. This was an expansion at a speed unseen in the history of communication. Most homes had only a single television, which automatically turned watching it into a shared family activity. It was nothing like today, where everyone stares at their own screen in their own room. On Sunday afternoons, television was not yet the sole source of entertainment, but it was steadily gaining importance. Some families would gather around the screen to watch baseball games, while others watched special programs aimed at children. Toward evening, the most important television moment of the week arrived for many households. The Sunday night variety shows were among the most talked about productions of the era and had become a fixed part of families' weekly schedules. Another classic ritual of the Sunday afternoon was the aimless car ride known as the Sunday drive. With no specific destination in mind, families would get into the car and cruise along country roads or through newly developing neighborhoods. These drives sometimes included a stop at an ice cream parlor, and sometimes a short picnic. With the increase in automobile ownership and the expansion of the suburbs in the post-war era, this tradition secured a permanent place in the lives of many middle-class families. The purpose of these drives was not to arrive somewhere. The purpose itself was the time spent together. The fields passing by the window, the newly built houses, the unfamiliar streets, all of it was a quiet way to shake off the exhaustion of the week. For some families, Sunday afternoons were spent at the grandparents' house. A multi-generational crowd would gather. The adults would play card games while the children chased fireflies in the yard or played hide and seek. Dominoes, checkers, and sometimes simple card games. These games were an ordinary yet beloved way to pass the time before returning to the table later in the day. Neighborhood relations were also very different from today. When a family experienced a hardship, when someone was hospitalized or the lawnmower broke down, neighbors would spontaneously rush to help. This was not an organized form of assistance. It was a natural part of daily life. As the 1960s progressed, some elements of this rhythm slowly began to change. There was a temporary decline in church attendance rates, especially among young adults. Historians explain the reasons for this through social changes and shifting priorities between generations, but there is no absolute consensus on the matter. Different interpretations are still being debated. Some states began to relax the blue laws, and large department stores started opening on Sundays. Television began to take up more and more of families' time. Still,
Throughout most of the 1960s and even the 1970s, that slow, quiet rhythm of the Sunday afternoon survived in many American homes. The change did not happen suddenly, but gradually, over decades. Store hours extended, television channels multiplied, and family schedules became even more packed. And finally, with the arrival of computers and a world with the internet, that special silence largely faded into history. Today, when we think of a Sunday afternoon, we often have a phone in our hands and a screen in front of us. But once upon a time, these hours belonged to something entirely different, to silence, to the dinner table, to time spent together, without rushing anywhere. Perhaps what made that era so special was that nothing was planned. No one had to stay connected because they were already right next to each other. No one had to reply to a notification because there was absolutely nothing to distract them. Today, for those who still remember a piece of those days, these images are perhaps not just nostalgic, but also carry a quiet sense of longing. And perhaps while watching this video, you too remembered your own family's table, your very own Sunday afternoon. The true value of that silence, of those hours spent together, is perhaps something we understand best right now.